What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 12 of season 1 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Season 1 is focusing on deliberative mini-publics. My guest for this episode is Adam Cronkright. Adam co-founded Democracy in Practice in 2013. Democracy in Practice is an organisation dedicated to democratic innovation, experimentation and capacity building, currently working in Bolivia. Before engaging in democratic innovation in Bolivia, Adam's passion for democracy led to a broad base of experience, which included an independent study of the jury system, dialoguing with members of the 2011 Icelandic Constituent Council, co-facilitating 2 NYC General Assemblies, co-writing the Spokes Council proposal at Occupy Wall Street, and teaching and learning at the democratically-run Brooklyn Free School. So, Adam, before we dive into discussing how Democracy in Practice uses deliberative mini-publics, can you tell us a little bit about how Democracy in Practice came about and what its role is?
Yeah, so we're a pretty diverse team of people from all over the Americas, one team member from Bolivia, from the States, 2 people from Canada. And we come at this from different places, and we have our own motivations, and we're passionate about different aspects of it. But I think that where we come together is that we have a shared understanding of kind of the key problem and the process that is most likely to generate solutions to this problem in our mind. And so for us, that key problem is a lack of democracy. A lot of people think that democracy means free and fair elections, but we don't. We see decisions that affect our communities and our societies being made in ways that are exclusive, unrepresentative, they're ineffective. And we feel that this underlies many of the important problems, like social problems, economic problems, environmental problems, that we see that seem to be just getting worse. So we see a lack of democracy in government, but we also see it in our homes, in our neighborhoods. We see it in schools, in workplaces. It's kind of strange that workplaces it's assumed that they're supposed to be autocratic. We see a lack of democracy in unions and even in social movements. And we think that this lack of democracy has some far-reaching and problematic consequences. But solving the problem is not as simple as just having everyday people kind of take back power. It's a lot easier to be democratic in very small communities and organizations where everybody can actually come together in the same room and make occasional collective decisions together. And it's way more complicated in even just a school of, say, 2,000 students, let alone a municipality the size of New York City or in something like the European Union. And so the real challenges we see it in modern society when it comes to democracy is that of this unprecedented scale, both in terms of the number of people who would participate and in terms of the number of decisions that need to be made and the complexity of those decisions. And so what attracted us to mini-publics and to random selection of representatives in general is its usefulness in addressing this challenge of scale. So, Ian Walker spoke in one of your episodes about the citizens' jury that they did with the city of Melbourne. You can't get everyone in Melbourne together in the same room to decide the city's budget, but you can, as he talked about, get a mini version of Melbourne together to make that decision. And I think that decision is going to be more representative of the community as a whole. And that process, which puts everyday people in the driver's seat, is probably it's probably as close as we can practically come to direct democracy, given the scale and the complexity of modern society. And so that's kind of how we as a team, that's the problem that we're going after, and that's why we're interested in mini-publics and random selection and those types of tools.
Deliberative mini-publics are pretty popular around the world, and they're conducted differently in different places. In Australia, they're definitely often commissioned by governments to help identify and resolve difficult issues. In the UK, academics have run them as sort of demonstration projects. You applying this sort of model in a school setting, which I just think is fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that came about and how it actually operates?
Yeah, it's funny. Originally, the first project that we thought we would be doing was with a neighborhood-owned, built, owned, and operated water utility. They're actually quite common here in Cochabamba in Bolivia, where I'm at. And we had an agreement with the leadership there, the elected leadership, that they were interested in shifting to something that would be randomly selected councils within their neighborhood organization. And we're quite excited about that. And then it seemed like at a certain point, the elected president of that organization really kind of soured on the idea of giving up his position and his power. And so we were kind of forced to look elsewhere, actually. And in fact, one of our advisors, Oscar Oliveira, who's here in Cochabamba, he turned us on to this idea of trying out in schools. They had been working in schools with some projects around gardening and ecology. And so we realized that this would be a great place to actually do the experimentation that we were looking to do with these alternatives. Schools are a really unique space because, especially when you're talking about student governments and trying out other forms of governing, it's a pretty safe space to try out new ideas and creative ideas, because if something doesn't go as expected, well, then it's a great learning opportunity for everybody involved. And frankly, the traditional form of student government has generated so much apathy and disinterest toward student government in a lot of the schools that we work in, that the bar is very low. And so when we try out things, we can be really creative with the students, and generally people are very pleased with what they're seeing. And so it's a very creative space. The young people that we're working with like to be creative, to try out different things. And so we kind of stumbled our way into working in schools, but it's turned out to be a really great space to start out in.
And can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you're actually putting into place in schools and how many schools are involved, that sort of thing, like an overview of what's actually happening there?
Yeah, we've just finished our third year working in schools here in Bolivia. And so far we've worked in primarily in 3 schools. They're all public schools, and they're all quite different. Some are rural. One is a rural K-8 school. There's a night high school. There's in the city, there's a morning time city school. And so we've been working in these different contexts, and the idea is that to take different approaches to student government that would be more inclusive, they'd be more representative, they'd be more effective. Because student government is it's a tool that has incredible potential for civic education and learning, but we feel that the traditional form of student government has really held it back. And so student governments around the world, student councils, they have different names, but they're typically modeled after adult government. And so you have, a small group of students that decides they want to be candidates. They form political parties, these little parties, and they run these short campaigns. And then there's an election, and the winners of that election become the president and the vice president and so on for the full school year. And the problem with that model is that, well, there's a few different problems, but the main one from our standpoint is that it tends to exclude quieter and less popular students, less charismatic students, because a lot of them don't even like the idea of becoming a candidate and going in front of the school and asking for votes, let alone have a realistic shot of winning a competitive election, competing against more charismatic, popular, ambitious students. And so it effectively excludes a large portion of the student population from entering into student government and getting to have this really great civic educational experience and leadership development. And so from our standpoint, the traditional structure of student government wasn't working. And the idea was to start experimenting creatively with different ways to structure student government, kind of break open the playbook. And to do that together with the students primarily, and also with staff and the teachers in the school. And so the major things that we have experimented with so far in these 3 years have been replacing elections with lotteries, so that the student representatives are randomly selected among volunteers. And so the students who want to enter the student government, doesn't matter if you're shy, doesn't matter if you're new at the school, doesn't matter if you're less popular. If you want to enter a team and work together on behalf of the whole student body, then you simply line up for the student lottery. And if you're randomly selected, then you're part of the team. We've also experimented with rotation, and so shortening term lengths. Instead of having the same few students form the student council for the whole school year, we have shorter term lengths of 3 or 4 months, depending on the school, depending on the specific context that we're working in. And you have other student lotteries throughout the school year, so that more students can enter in the student government, and they rotate participation, getting more students directly involved in the school year. And the third major thing that we have been experimenting with and have been tinkering with over time is doing away with the traditional roles, the hierarchical roles of president and vice president and so on, and having the students work together as a team of equals, so working horizontally. And so we've made these changes. We went into the schools and we talked with the staff there, the teachers, we talked with the students, and we pitched these major changes of moving from elections to lotteries, from full-year terms to rotation, from hierarchy to working together in horizontal teams. And we have, over time, been adapting and changing the design together with students and getting their input. And we've also been there throughout the whole process as advisors to the student governments. And so we don't have a vote in the student government meetings, but we build their capacity, we orient them, we try and help them. We kind of teach about the basics of facilitation, of note-taking, of helping them develop their own rules and norms for working together. And what we've also been trying to do is develop ways in which we can kind of work ourselves out of a job so that students would then develop the capacity of other students. So as somebody's finishing their term of office, they are teaching and building the capacity of newly randomly selected students. And so we provide tools, we provide capacity building, and we're trying to work towards them being independent, autonomous, and we're also trying to, a big push for this year ahead of us is, so far the students and staff have made some suggestions and some smaller tweaks to the design that we proposed, but we want students to really start owning the experimentation themselves. So we're looking at some real tangible ways that we could put students into the driver's seat and get them thinking about their own designs that may be completely different from what we put into place, but the idea is to start experimenting with creative ways to rethink government and to do that in schools.
And how old are the young? You've said it's 3 different types of schools. Like, what's the age range that you're working with?
Well, for the first 2 years, we worked in a rural school that was kindergarten through 8th grade. And we also have worked we just finished our 3rd year in a night high school. And so these are students that typically work during the day and they go to school from 7 to 10 p.m. at night. And so a lot of them are older. Some of them already have their own families. A lot of them live alone. So quite a broad range of ages.
It's incredible. Have some of the quieter people put their hand up to be part of the selection process?
Definitely. And we don't have hard numbers regarding this, but so first off, with the selection process, you don't typically put your hand up. There's a ton of different ways that you can do random selection or lotteries. And what we typically suggest in the schools and the students become quite good at is randomly selecting with fava beans, actually. So you got 2 different colored fava beans, green and purple, and you have a pot. And they even do stratified sampling for controlling for gender and often for grade level. And so students will be invited to line up, actually, and they reach into the pot one by one and pull out a fava bean. And if it's purple, then they've been randomly selected, and they will serve a term of office. And if it's green, then they can hope for better luck the next time that the lottery comes around. And so it's actually quite a fun process for them. And everybody kind of wants to see if they're going to get picked. And so a lot of people tend to enter the lottery. At the school that we started at this year, the students said that the previous year when they had elections, there were 3 parties with 5 to 6 candidates in each party. So that's just under 20 students that volunteered to be candidates and wanted to enter the student government. And this year, it was over 200 students in the same school that lined up to enter the lottery, which is about half of the school. So we've seen a real increase in students wanting to participate, wanting to enter the student government because it's shifted to a lottery from elections. And anecdotally, with all the student governments we've worked with, typically at the end of a student's term of office, we'll ask that group, if we had had normal elections, would you have been candidates instead of lotteries? And so these are students that are finishing their term of office. And about 3/4 of the students say, no, I wouldn't have been candidates had it been normal elections. And you see a whole range of social skills in the student governments once they're selected. And there's students who are very quiet. And there's also very ambitious, very charismatic students who probably would have been very successful candidates that also enter the lottery and get randomly selected. And so you have a real range there.
One of the things that interests me about this is, I know from just my personal experience, with children here in Australia, is that oftentimes here the children will put their hand up to be selected for, say, to be the school captain, and the teachers will decide between the candidates on the basis of who they think has leadership skills, etc. So how did the teachers respond to this? Because teachers seem to take that sort of issue of, I suppose, leadership skills, role modelling and so on quite seriously in terms of picking people to sit in leadership positions. How did they feel beforehand, and what sort of feedback are you getting from teachers down the track about the children that are involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've had a range of responses from teachers. I can say that right from the start, from the very beginning, the great majority of teachers are at least publicly supportive of the idea, because we will go into a school and we'll talk about leadership development. And what we'll point out is that the status quo is basically a popularity contest among students to decide which few students get to develop leadership skills and civic skills. Because outside of student governments, at least in Bolivia, I know the high school that I went to in the US, there aren't a lot of curricula designed around leadership development, civic skills, and often that's kind of the purview of the student government. And so when we point out that, in effect, we're discriminating against shyer and more timid students, who are the ones that kind of most need those opportunities to develop public speaking skills or the ability to facilitate a meeting, when we point that out, it's rather difficult for a teacher in front of their colleagues to say, no, I don't think that we should kind of even the playing field and give those quieter students an equal chance to develop those skills. And so that's kind of the way that we come at it, and there's generally a very positive response from teachers. There's always a few teachers that say, no, it has to be elections, that's the way, that's democracy, but the majority of them recognize that there are students that are passed over year after year, both in the classroom and outside the classroom with this student government, passed over for these opportunities to really develop the skills that they are very much lacking. And so that's kind of the way that we pitch it. And then as it goes, even the student or even the teachers that are often very much in favor of the idea of randomly selecting, sometimes they had real trouble with the idea of a horizontal team. There has to be a president, there has to be a head to this group. They cannot possibly just kind of share these different responsibilities and stuff. And you would see in important events when the Minister of Education would be visiting the school, you would see pushback from teachers that how can this person address the minister on behalf of the student government? It has to be this other student who speaks really well. And we would have to push back and say, this is an educational environment. Let's give them a chance. And we've seen a lot more difficulty with changing that mentality with teachers. With the students, they grab a hold of it quite quickly, usually, that everybody has an equal shot. And oftentimes within the student government that's been randomly selected, they will randomly select amongst themselves to go and speak on behalf of the group in an important engagement. And so it just kind of becomes the de facto way, the fair way of distributing those opportunities. Then as the process goes, you see teachers that come out of the woodwork saying, I've noticed a real big change in the classroom from this student who was randomly selected, went into the student government. I originally thought, this is going to be a disaster. And they became more responsible, or they became more outgoing. Now they participate more. And so we've had some real champions from certain teachers that have seen those changes. And the kindergarten through 8th grade rural school that we worked in for 2 years, we went back this year. We actually we moved on from that school for a variety of different reasons, but we went back to visit, and they've continued on with this structure. And so the teachers have helped the students continue on with this. They still have lotteries. They have the same type of structure and rotation. And so the teachers have been quite supportive on the whole, and especially once they see it going.
And I know, as well as sort of your anecdotal evidence, I know that you've been doing some research into these processes. What have you been looking at, and what have you been finding? The
research that we've been doing, we were fortunate to get a grant from the New Democracy Foundation. I know Carson and Ian Walker have been on your podcast previously, and so that allowed us to do an investigation into the way that students and staff in these schools, in 2 schools in particular, make sense of these changes from elections to random selection to rotation to horizontal teams. And so it was a really great opportunity to sit down and interview students and teachers and get a sense of where they're at. And we're still in the process of analyzing our data and collecting that. But I can say that we've seen pretty overwhelming support for these changes, and the great majority of students and staff say that they would like the student government to continue with this form, and they also recommend these practices be implemented in other schools as well. And so it's been really interesting to see, and it's not everybody. There's certainly people that would like to go back to elections. There's people that want a mixed structure, and so it's been really interesting to sit down and ask them about their views on these changes and to get a whole range of answers.
And so are you intending to sort of expand into other schools, or what's the sort of next on the agenda for democracy in practice?
This coming year, we're continuing in a school that we started this past year. So we're 1 year into that school, and we want to continue working there and continue developing ways that they can actually be autonomous and we can work ourselves out of job, as I mentioned earlier. And at the same time, taking time to develop resources. So when we presented this project at the World Forum for Democracy in Strasbourg in November, there was a really positive reaction from people in our lab session. And we had a lot of people approach us saying, I'd like to do something similar in Guatemala, or I'd like to do something similar in my school, and wondering if we had resources that we could provide. And right now, there's some things on our website, and there's some videos and stuff about the ideas, and we're there to Skype and provide support, but we really want to develop resources, toolkits that people can go to, be they handouts or videos. We'd love to have to create videos of the students describing how they operate, how they do lotteries, how they facilitate their meetings, what different things they've tried out, that they can speak to other students who might be wanting to implement this in their schools. And so we're looking at this challenge of disseminating, not specifically these practices or the way that it's being done there, but even more broadly, the idea that we should be more creative. Student government, as it's currently structured, isn't working for the needs of students. And so encouraging staff, but even more so students in other schools in Bolivia, but more broadly, to get creative and to start tinkering themselves and to share what they're learning. And so that's something that we want to start doing with respect to this project in schools, and continue our learning together in the school that we're in currently with the students. We're also on the horizon here, we're in some serious talks with a union here in Bolivia about helping them kind of redesign union governance, which has been really interesting, and we'll see starting in 2017 how far we can go with them. There's some real interest in this. It's a very slow process of starting to work, expanding beyond schools and working in adult organizations. So that's kind of what's on the horizon for us at the moment.
That sounds great. So Adam, can you tell us more broadly what the learnings have been from the work of democracy in practice?
Yeah, 3 years into this, we've learned a lot of things, and we continue to learn a lot of things from our work together with the students. There's a whole lot of things that I could talk about. I think I should probably just touch on a few that are probably most relevant to your listeners that aren't necessarily confined to schools themselves in that setting. One is that we shouldn't underestimate the need to provide scaffolding and support. And this was actually something that Peter MacLeod, who was from Mass LBP in Canada, was on your podcast, had said to us over 3 years ago when we were just getting started, that just the random selection itself is great, but then once people are randomly selected, the lottery's over, they will need support. They don't just automatically know how to facilitate meetings in really democratic and effective ways and to execute projects and the like. And so we've seen a real need to provide that scaffolding and support. We were very focused on the civic lotteries, and that's really 1% of our work. It's actually quite simple. The students have got it down. It's everything after the lottery that is such a challenge, and it's a great challenge, and that's where most of our learning lies, is in the capacity building. And these skills that people need to govern effectively, they're not typically taught in schools, at least not in an intentional way. So like I mentioned, the art of facilitation, for instance. But the thing that we've seen is that they are indeed learned and learnable skills. And I think that we actually go a bit beyond the capacity building that is offered to citizens in most citizens' juries and the like, because the randomly selected participants that we're dealing with, these students, they have to facilitate their own meetings. They do their own administrative and logistical work. They execute their own decisions. And so we don't have professional facilitation that can help ease along the process. And so we're busy developing those types of self-facilitation skills within the group. For instance, in these schools, the role of facilitator, for instance, rotates either every 2 meetings or every meeting, depending on the school. And we have students trying to teach other students in that rotation. And so there's a real need to develop those skills. And I would think that goes for, random selection of decision makers and of representatives outside of schools as well. But it doesn't take so long to get people working effectively in that way. And it's doable. These are learnable skills. People aren't born, as democratic deliberators. And so that's something that we've seen, and that's something we've seen a real need for. But it's also very realizable. Another thing that I think large lessons kind of come out of this work is that if you want to build kind of real democracy, there are indeed structural changes that are important, such as civic lotteries, moving from elections to lotteries. Those are things that we're fascinated by, and they're very important structural changes. But it's also incredibly important to develop a democratic culture that accompanies and fortifies that. And that's not something that I personally thought much about when we started this work 3 years ago. I was really, really fascinated by structural changes and processes and tools. And when you get into it, you realize that those are incredibly important. But if we want this thing to be self-sustaining in a school, for instance, then no level of, you can have the best tools and the best processes and the best structure in place in the world. And if there's not a culture developed in that school, a democratic culture that values coming together as equals, that values equal power relations, that wants to defend that structure, then it's most likely that over time, someone clever, someone ambitious will find ways to manipulate that structure and kind of consolidate power for whatever reason. And so what we're seeing is that these structures are working quite well. The students like them. But we're seeing another dimension of our work that we need to start focusing on, which is developing a culture in the school that takes pride in the democratic nature of the student government and that wants to defend that and to expand that, so that if we're not there 2 years from now and somebody tries to kind of reel in the democratic nature of the student government, that you would have students that spontaneously step up and say, no, that's not how we operate, that's not in line with our values, and that they would try to defend those processes. That's a huge element that we've realized and that we're starting to really try to emphasize, is developing that value set to accompany the structural changes that we put in place.
That's wonderful, and I can see why you need to develop processes and tools to share what you're learning, because I can imagine around the world people would be keen to not necessarily just do exactly what you did, but learn some things ahead of time that you've learned in practice. Any other lessons that you'd like to share? Because I'm just thinking here that there will be educators listening to this podcast, and in advance of them being able to get tools and so on from you, what other things do you think they should know?
Well, speaking to educators, I think that one thing that we've been pleasantly surprised by is that, and again, it's anecdotal, but we're working with quite a few students over these 3 years. And one thing that Raul and I here in Bolivia have consistently seen is that the students who appear to be the leader types, when they're randomly selected and the group just comes together in their first few meetings and they're getting oriented, there's a few students that stand out for their ability to speak well, their composure, their charisma. And you think to yourself, okay, this is going to be a pillar of the team. This is going to be somebody that the team kind of builds around. And then you have other students that are often very quiet. They're a bit disengaged. They're kind of looking at the clock, and you think, oh man, this is going to be a real challenge to the student. We've got our work cut out for us here to get them engaged, to get them excited, to get them participating actively. And most of the time, I would say that by the end of the 3-month term of office, you've completely flipped in the way that you see those students. And it's often the more charismatic students, the type that you would pick out of a crowd and say, oh, that person would win the election and be the president of the school, that often don't even make it through the first month of their term of office before they either quit or they're kicked out by the group because they don't show up on time or they don't follow through with the things that they say they're going to do. or they dominate meetings. And so you see that. And then on the other hand, you have those students that were very quiet at the beginning, and they might not be the most talkative at the end of the 3 months. But during that time, the rest of the team has seen that they show up on time, they take on responsibilities and follow through with what they said they're going to do. And so I think that ourselves, we and the students are also kind of learning new conceptions of what it means to be a leader in a democratic group, and what kind of skills are important and what kind of skills aren't so important. And it's really surprising. And from outside the student government, you often don't see it. You still have teachers coming up and saying about the more charismatic student in the student government, oh, that's such a leader, he's such a leader type. And inside the student government, everybody says, oh, he never shows up, he doesn't follow through. And so it's just really interesting to see that play out, and to see students, quieter students who would never make it into student government through elections, end up being oftentimes the real pillar of the team that everybody knows they can count on.
I like that idea of a different form of democratic leadership. And to think that people are learning that in schools is fantastic. So,
I guess one other thing that I could add, for speaking to educators, civic educators, or teachers in general, I have a close friend who is a teacher in a public school in Canada, actually, and kind of inspired by some of the stuff that we were playing around with, he started playing around with in his math class, in his 8th grade math class. And we've had teachers in these schools who, when we talked to them, they started using random selection to give out, say, speaking assignments or presentation assignments, because each presentation had to be different, and they knew that there was going to be claims of favoritism if they handed them out. And so they would randomly assign them, and there was no more complaints. And so encouraging teachers to not just think about this in the realm of student government and politics and that type of a thing and leadership development, but also think about things like random selection, like rotation in their classrooms as ways to close the gap of social skills that tends to open with every year that students are in school. Because oftentimes it's your more talkative, more outgoing students that put their hand up first, that volunteer to speak in front of the class, that get picked by teachers. And your quieter students oftentimes tend to hide themselves, or they get passed over. And so with every year, that gap tends to widen. And random selection is an interesting tool from an educational standpoint, because it does away with that type of self-selection bias or bias on behalf of the teacher. And it gives everybody that equal chance to present in front of the classroom or to take on certain tasks as a student. And so it's something to consider for sure, and to start playing around with.
Oh, that's good advice. Thank you for joining me to learn more about how deliberation and selection by lottery is working in schools in Bolivia. In the next episode of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast, I'll be talking to Caroline Lukensmeyer, the current Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse in the US and founder of America Speaks. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.